Good morning. You're locked in live, and I'm your host, Algenon Cash. Every Sunday morning, I invite you to join me right here on WTOB at 8 a.m. for the only public affairs radio show that offers you my commentary on a wide range of topics. And of course, you'll also get a little sneak peek at some of the values and principles that I use in my own life to get out and achieve success. So welcome back. If you're a returning listener, welcome back. If you're a new listener, we're glad to have you this morning. But as you always know, I always like to remind you, the show is never about Algenon. It's always about you. It's all about what you're going to get out of it. And my job is to help you stay engaged and informed about issues happening in your country, your state, and of course, right here in your own backyard. And I want this show to always be a place where you can get positive advice, helpful tips, and helpful strategies that will help you become stronger, more connected, and ultimately more successful. So if you're a returning listener, you know what all this is about. If you're a new listener, I promise you, I guarantee you, you're going to enjoy the Locked In experience. Here's how the show works. I always bring you a special guest to share insight. And this week I have Antoinette Kerr joining me. She's a media correspondent and CEO of Borden Bright Media. But always, before we kick into the real action, I like to provide you my thoughts on a particular news story that I'm following. Sometimes I'll cover multiple stories, but this morning I just want to talk to you about what's going on in Washington, D.C. Senate Republicans failed to reach a deal with the White House on stimulus legislation late this past week. And if you recall, last week on the show, I shared with you that I had an inside source inside of Congress that was already telling me that Senator McConnell was having a really tough time, not only getting Republicans in his chamber on board, but also getting the White House on board with the GOP proposal. And if you remember, I early reported last Sunday that these negotiations were going to likely extend into August. And now the Washington Post is reporting and confirming the same thing. So it does look like it's going to be another week before we get a real true idea of what that Senate proposal or the Senate Republicans proposal is in terms of stimulus, and it actually could take even a few more weeks for that bill to get written and of course approved. Now, of course, there are more than 20 million Americans that were receiving federal unemployment benefits, $600 a week, and those payments pretty much are going to stop until Congress reaches a deal. So whatever that payment you got last week was the last payment you'll get until Congress can figure this out. Now, I will tell you, I agree that Senate Republicans should oppose a continuation of those benefits in its current form. You know, somewhere around 42% of unemployed workers have been receiving more than what they would have earned in their original wages. And that presents a significant disincentive for people to return to working, which is also driving complications between small businesses that are attempting to reopen. So discussions around this point have been contentious, with GOP leaders proposing to reduce the benefit to around $200 a week, and possibly even tying it back to some type of a wage replacement rate. So if you think about it this way, typically states will replace somewhere around 45% of the wages that you were earning originally. And now Senate Republicans are proposing that any federal benefits would only replace wages up into around 70 or 75%. Some Senate Republicans actually want to just see the benefit go to a $200 flat benefit per week. So there's still a lot of negotiation and a lot of wrangling going on within the Senate. I do think it's so important that we find a way to extend these unemployment benefits. It's not only the smart thing to do economically, but it's also the right thing to do to support our neighbors who are going through a really, really tough time. But I think we must ensure that any extension is driven by the state and only supported and backed by the feds. I really think the states need to take the driver's seat when it comes to unemployment benefits. And so hopefully, as we continue to progress forward, we can come to some kind of a compromise that will help those more than 20 million Americans that are struggling. Also, the GOP proposed $1 trillion package is starkly different from the $3 trillion bill that House Democrats passed back in May. The GOP proposal does provide $105 billion for schools and teachers, liability protection for employers, another $1,200 in direct payments to individuals and families, and a second round of PPP loans, which is the payroll protection program that helps so many struggling small businesses at the outset of the COVID-19 outbreak. They also provide another $16 billion for coronavirus testing and then tax incentives to companies to rehire workers and adopt safety measures. But I do believe one thing that's absent from the GOP proposal that definitely needs to be reconsidered is that Senate Republicans must look at a way at providing additional financial relief to state and local government. If state and local government does not get additional federal money to help them navigate through this unprecedented time, you will see a massive round of layoffs that are coming here very soon. And you right now, you've got governors and you've got mayors all around the country that are wrangling to try to figure out if they can reduce public services simply because they've got very large budget shortfalls that they're having to deal with. So keep your eyes on Congress going into this upcoming week. It's going to be a big week in the Senate. And then, of course, once they do agree on a package, they've got to negotiate that with House Democrats. And then, of course, get President Trump and top White House officials on board with it. So with that said, that's the news that I'm following. I want to kick into the main heart of the program today. I want all of my listeners current to welcome Antoinette Kerr. As I stated before, she's a media correspondent and CEO of Borden Media. Ms. Kerr, how you doing this morning?
I am doing well. How are you?
I'm doing well. I'm doing well. Now I've got to let the listeners know I'm calling her Miss Kerr this morning, but Ann is an old friend who I haven't seen in a very long time, but she's always doing some great and amazing work. Ann, last time I saw you, you were doing some nonprofit work down in Lexington. I think you're also contributing a writer or journalist for the Dispatch, which is your daily paper down in Lexington. Help my listeners, give my listeners a little bit of background and context on what led you here to Locked In Live this morning with me.
Okay, great. Well, always good to connect with you. And I kind of like you calling me Miss Kerr, so I hope to be back on the show more often. It's kind of nice. I'm like, oh, okay, that would be my mom. But I have been really doing some research. I worked in the nonprofit world in Lexington for a while. I'm currently a co-director of Women Advance, which is a storytelling group of women, and I connected with a group of men in the eastern part of North Carolina in the Robeson County, Lumberton area. And what I discovered about police accountability was really shocking. Since then, with the murder of George Floyd, this is coming up for a lot of people in conversation. So I really started to do some work and some research. I'm a media correspondent. Right now, I'm currently with about 10 different publications or entities. And at the time, I was a producer for the Public News Service, which is a radio station that provides free audio content to a lot of groups across North Carolina. So as I really got more involved in this research, I realized that most people do not know that there are laws in place that keep us from really holding police accountable in a way that protects the everyday lives of citizens. So I'll just start out with that, but I really just started, there were 3 murders in Robeson County. And this happened in April of 2017. So I started going down and doing research about these murders. And as I did that research, I realized that police weren't providing information. And in some ways, how they handled the cases, it wasn't being reported on. So I started doing that research and reporting. And that's what led me to an opportunity to have this conversation with you.
Well, I'm glad to have you here this morning and glad to reconnect with you. Before we jump into the real heart of our conversation, I know we're going to talk a little bit about an article that you recently wrote for Scalawag magazine calling for additional police reform and more police accountability. But you also have a publishing company now, right? And is that the Bold and Bright Media? Tell the listeners a little bit about the publishing company, what you're working on, and what kind of content you're producing.
Bold and Bright Media is a new publishing company. We really decided to shake things up. You know me, I like to shake things up all the time. So in the book publishing world, we actually have a book that is coming out tomorrow, and it's called Robots Make Bad Fundraisers. What we try to do in the Bold and Bright Media publishing world is take nonprofit guides, make them really simple, easy to read, things that, like I said before, I came from the nonprofit background, and a lot of times I just needed basic information, but the big publishers, they want to publish academic text. So our publishing purpose is really to help people tell stories that help people do good work in the nonprofit realm. So we have books on fundraising. We have books on media relations. My book, Modern Media Relations for Nonprofits, talks about, I took what I learned in the nonprofit world and what I learned in the media relations world, combine those two things. And if you need to have good media relations, even if you're a nonprofit, then Modern Media Relations is the book for you.
And so for the listeners who want to learn more about some of the great content that you're publishing, how do they find that? Is that a website they need to go to, or are your books available on Amazon? How do we get to the information?
So both our books are on Amazon, but you definitely should check out our Readers Network, and it's on our website. It's boldandbrightmedia.com. So if you go to boldandbrightmedia.com and sign on to the Readers Network, you'll get all the exclusive details and discounts and information. But we are on Amazon, and we're also available in your local independent bookstore or Barnes & Noble.
Well, I encourage all of my listeners to go check out Bold and Bright Media, look at some of the great work that they're producing. Go check out the website that Ms. Kerr just mentioned to you. If you're just now joining us, if you're late to the program, you're locked in live. I'm your host, Algenon Cash, and I'm speaking with Miss Antoinette Kerr, who is a media correspondent and CEO of Bold and Bright Media. Ms. Kerr, you just wrote an article, or recently wrote an article for Scallywag Magazine. And let me just pull that article up. It's called "This North Carolina Law Lets Police Keep Racism and Abuse Under Wraps." Tell our listeners a little bit about the article.
The article was, again, it was a result of over a year of waiting for an indictment. So an officer was indicted, and this particular officer, I had several sources tell me that this officer was involved in human trafficking. And this officer had gone on and left the police department in 2016, but had been indicted after an SBI investigation. It took a year for me to get something that we should have had, I should have had access to immediately. And so I started doing some research and actually reaching out to folks about the North Carolina Open Records Law. And in this article, you'll see I interviewed several journalists. I interviewed people who are familiar with the law. And one of the people who's an attorney helped me write some legal language to really go forward and say, I should have access to this indictment. And Algenon, when I got this access to this indictment, this officer had been accused, or is accused, of forcible rape and kidnapping of a 16-year-old Lumbee woman. And when I got that, I thought, okay, this cannot stay here. This cannot go on. This officer was also released from custody in March. So these are things that we don't have access to. And one of the people that I interviewed, Jeremy Borden, who works with Untold Stories, he really made a good point. He said that public information belongs to the public. And the fact that we can't have access to disciplinary actions or criminal records of folks in law enforcement, people who have the ability to take lives, then we are really missing out on significant information. And so every a failed attempt for public information is a failure of public government. And the fact that I even have to make these requests without it being made public and open is a failure of public government. So what I really thought in this article is that I should call for accountability from our government. We have all sorts of wonderful proclamations, but I can tell you, after doing research for a year about these 3 women who were murdered in Robeson County, and the police are not calling them murders. They're not calling them homicides. They're calling them undetermined causes of death. So after doing that research and work for a year, I can tell you that there is those proclamations that are put out about open and transparent government are worth the paper that they're written on. And I don't think they're written on paper anymore. So,
well, I wanna read just a quick excerpt. I've read the article several times, and really encourage my listeners to go out and find the article as well. We'll make sure we get you some good instructions on how you can locate the article. But just a quick excerpt here. We're just going to go out and start slaughtering them, said Wilmington, North Carolina police officer Michael Kevin Piner. referring to black people with an expletive and a racial slur. I can't wait. God, I can't wait. And you go on to talk about how Chief of Police Donnie Williams ended up letting these officers go, and just how different that is and how new that is. And obviously, you go on to talk a little bit about some of what the reforms need to look like for policing. Can you help me understand what does police reform look like, to you?
Well, and I'll go back to that particular case, which actually was left to the discretion of the chief of police. And it was because our North Carolina open records law are so ambiguous that there was actually a behind the scenes lawsuit to keep this information about those 3 officers that had the conversation about slaughtering people of color. And the fact that there was a question that this information might not be available to be released is another example of the problem with our laws, our open record laws. And again, you have people who have the ability to take lives. You have the people who have the ability to harm without getting arrested. Look at how long it took officers in each of the cases where we've seen promoted even to George Floyd and Breonna Taylor. Look how long it takes for folks to even get arrested, and that's with a public outcry. So my first thing would be, you said keep an eye on what they're doing in DC. My thing is, let's keep an eye on what's going on in North Carolina. North Carolina is one of 23 states that does not allow us to have access to past criminal records of law enforcement officers, not criminal records, but past records or disciplinary records of law enforcement officers. And we all know that if anybody, any citizen review committee, if any person had seen the officers that were involved in the murder of George Floyd, if they had seen their past disciplinary records, they wouldn't be employed as law enforcement officers. So I think one of the very basic things is to ask North Carolina to change their open record laws to make disciplinary actions of law enforcement available for public information. And I think the other thing is really put in some teeth in how long people have to provide information. So right now, the North Carolina public records law say that they have to provide certain things that are public record, if it's not questionable, within a reasonable time frame. Now, what does that mean? Yeah. What does that mean to you? A reasonable time frame? Well, I could tell you for the Lumberton folks that it took me a year to get information from, and they bounced me around and told me that since it was an SBI investigation, they didn't have it, which I knew that they did. But reasonable for them was it took a year for me to find out, and this person has already been released before trial, and it took me for a year for me to get the indictment that allegedly involves the rape of a 16-year-old young woman.
Yeah, I'm many of my listeners know I'm in the restaurant business, and I like any other restaurant, we get complaints from time to time, and I have to remind customers that there's sometimes some days we don't get it right, and we make mistakes. But there are some professions out there where you just can't make mistakes, right? If you're a brain surgeon, you just got to get it right. You got to get it right every time. If you're an airline pilot, you probably got to get it right. You got to get it right every single time. And I think oftentimes even with our police, that expectation is there as well. And so, you brought up the case about Officer Chauvin in the George Floyd situation, and I think he had a dozen or a couple of dozen previous complaints on him. I don't know the number right offhand. But how does that happen? How do you have that many issues, or that many incidents, that many complaints? That would be akin to an airline pilot who has crashed a plane a dozen times, but some kind of way still finds an airline to give him a job. How does that work in police? Why is it so different?
You tell me. I don't know. When I went on to WUNC, I was on the state of things, and we were invited. I say we because I have some colleagues and some folks Crystal Keck, who couldn't be here today because she's on another, working on something else, who has been doing research about missing and murdered Indigenous women for years and had been running into this block with secrecy with law enforcement. Crystal's a part of the Alamance Agents for Change group, which has done some really great work in calling for police accountability. But she thought that I could get information as a journalist that she couldn't get. And I thought I could too, but once I started to do research with her, I noticed that. So how does this happen? We invited Sheriff Wilkins, who is the sheriff in the cases that I've been investigating, the cold cases and the deaths of Christine Bennett, Rhonda Jones, and Megan Oxendine. These three women were their cases, I say, have been mishandled by law enforcement. For example, evidence has gone missing, and the medical examiner said he was told to destroy it. So when we asked him to come on, he didn't come on. So I really would love to have some folks from law enforcement talk about that, because there's, no one's all good in any industry or all bad in any industry, but this protection of information and this secrecy is really something that's surprising. I'll give you another example. In 2001, the same police department that I have been working to find out how they're handling cases. And I didn't go in with an idea of investigating police misconduct. That wasn't what I wanted to do. I wanted to find out who murdered these three women, and why their deaths were, and their families want to know why their deaths are not classified as homicides yet. They're still not. And one woman was found stuffed in a trash can. All three were found naked. So how did they die? Their toxicology reports don't suggest anything other. But in that saying, I didn't go in with that sense. But in 2001, this same department was investigated by the SBI. They fired 22 police officers, Algenon, and charged them with things from everything from like stealing cable to intimidating witnesses to robbery to drug trafficking. And this is an entire department in our eastern part of the state. It reads like, the indictments read like training day. And have you heard about this? Like, have you ever heard about this called Operation Tarnish Badge? It was a huge issue. And so what I tried to do is get access, because some of those folks are still involved with the cases that I'm investigating for my research. And I tried to get access to the personnel records in the past. Even that's blocked. And the FBI didn't trust, and SBI didn't trust this police department enough after indicting 22 of its officers to keep their drug forfeiture money. So when you're out in the community and people are saying that they don't trust police, in this particular case, as I interviewed officers, and they said, we have conspiracy fatigue. People always think there's a conspiracy. Well, in this particular case, there's a reason not to. And this level of secrecy really keeps information out of the hands of people. And I think it does create a wedge of trust from public and public information. I feel like these types of incidents where, we know that Tarnish Badge happened in 2001, it was a 6-year investigation. Robeson County just got the ability to maintain their drug forfeiture money back. And right now, I would think that if I was in that situation or in that seat, I'm not. So I'm kind of like sideline quarterbacking here, that you would want to be as public and transparent as possible. That's really the only way that I'm understanding that you're going to regain trust. And so I see that in other communities, like, to speak to Forsyth County, where I know you have a lot of wisdom and experience, but several people have died in the hands of the Forsyth County detention jails, and it's mysterious.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. If you're just tuning in, I just want to let you know you're locked in live. I'm your host this Sunday morning. My name is Algenon Cash. You're listening to Miss Antoinette Kerr, who is a media correspondent and CEO of Borden Bright Media. She also just recently wrote a article for Scallywag Magazine, really highlighting the issue around police accountability and the need for more transparency when it comes to police records. And Ms. Kerr, I am running out of time here, so I do want to try to work in a few more questions with you before we have to end. I do have a quick question from the audience. The question is, have you done any research on law enforcement certification being maintained when officers have clearly crossed the line on what is acceptable and lawful behavior?
That is a good question. I have not done any research, but I'll tell you, I will put that on my list to ask, and definitely will put that on my list to ask.
Yeah, we'll have to get you back on to maybe, not only tackle that question, but obviously a whole lot more. One thing that I'm sort of thinking about is, I would imagine, like anything else, I've worked in public policy for, almost 20 years or more now. I can't believe I'm dating myself, badly here this morning. But, anytime you're trying to reform a system, there's always some kind of impediments and obstacles to be able to allow that reform to happen. I mean, you talked extensively here in your article and even this morning about the how hard it is to access public records. Also I'm sure my listeners understand that oftentimes in these issues or these situations, the police is investigating themselves through their own internal affairs department, which, most times police officers are going to go a little bit easy on each other. Obviously you've got unions in place that are working to protect the current process. And then you have officers who have the right to appeal these decisions. And then those appeals are oftentimes based on decisions that occur with prior outcomes. So if you're coming into a department and you're looking to change or overhaul that department, even as you try to reform the department, you're still dealing with these prior decisions made in prior cases as it relates to these officers. My question is this: do you really believe the current system can be reformed in the context of all these impediments?
I think that the current system has to be reformed through a couple of different ways. I'll really encourage people to go back to the Alamance Agents for Change site, because I know several people involved with that movement, and I really like the way that they have laid things out. But I'll tell you how this impacts us on an everyday basis, because sometimes it's hard until it happens to you. It's hard with these big issues. But one thing that I realized or saw, several law enforcement across the state have been bad at processing rape kits. We know that. We've seen things change under the new, under Cooper's administration. They've actually made it, put a criminal penalty out there for law enforcement who don't process rape kits. But in a situation just last, and I think it was in, I want to say January, several law enforcement officers resigned due to being found that they did not process a rape kit of someone who allegedly went out and raped and killed a 13-year-old there. And they had the evidence, they had the DNA evidence. It had been returned from the state and they didn't process it. And so what happened is these folks were terminated from employment. My question as a journalist is, how has this continued to go on? How has this been protected? And we will not know those answers. And that won't bring reform unless we can really get to, how does this look the other way system? Because we weren't the first people to find out that they weren't processing rape kits. In the case of the 3 women that I've been working on, their rape kits sat on the shelf for 12 plus months. And so if people are doing simple things like that, it's not all just about brutality. It's also about sometimes incompetence or sometimes mishandling. In a situation with Rhonda Jones, I found out that I got her autopsy report from family, and there was a gray blanket that was the only potentially piece of DNA evidence that was destroyed by law enforcement. So these are things that, you ask, I don't know the answers. I'm a journalist, so I did not study to be in law enforcement, but I really want law enforcement to tell us what they are doing to change it. And I want government to hold them accountable by changing legislation that actually gives the public access to hold them accountable. So I don't have the answers, but I think you should get someone on your show who does. But then we have to do our part as people and demand the accountability when the answers come forward, so that people aren't protected in jobs where either they're mishandling evidence or they're mishandling people.
Yeah,
So that would be my recommendation.
Yeah, I want to squeeze in one more question. I've literally got about a minute here remaining, but some people are calling for the complete end of policing in its current form. How do you feel about the whole defund the police movement? Like I said, I've got about a minute here remaining.
Oh, sure. Well, again, I want the law enforcement folks to come up with a solution. I think that we need a level of law enforcement, and I know a lot of people who use that term defund. Again, I'll go back to Alan Mann's Agents for Change, because in my original article, it did say that they wanted defunding. They were very clear with me that they wanted to divert resources. And that is the thing that I know people have wanted to talk about before. This huge investment in law enforcement isn't the only way to deter crime. It is not the only way to approach community solutions. But when we do need law enforcement, we need to be able to trust and hold people accountable. So if that answers your question, defund is not the language that I use. I know that it means a lot of things to a lot of people. And so I'll just put it out there that every time you hear defund, it is not exactly how it sounds. So from a marketing perspective, I like the way that Alan Mance has shifted it to diverting resources.
You're locked in live right here on WTOB every Sunday morning at 8 a.m. Join me, Algenon Cash, for the only public affairs radio show in the region, providing you my unique insight and commentary. Thank you, Miss Antoinette Kerr, for joining us and spending some time with us this morning. Again, Antoinette Kerr, media correspondent, CEO of Borden Media. Please go check out the publishing company. Go find the article in Scallywag Magazine. It's a great article. Ms. Kerr, really quick here, how can they find your article?
You can look me up. If you Google me, you'll see several of my articles that I've written on this topic. Muckrack is actually a really cool system that keeps all of them together. So you can go to Scallywag's website, or you can look it up, look me up on Google, and you'll find me easily there. Some people have a hard time spelling my name, so I'm like, you'll find me on Google.
Well, I encourage my listeners to do that, and also make sure you mark your calendar to be right back here next Sunday morning, 8 a.m. right here on WTOB. Come lock in with me.